Good morning again, everyone, and good Shabbos. How often do we want people to know our names? We like it. We like to hear the sound of our name no matter who it's coming from. And yet, how often do we forget other people's names? I remember the first time I met Rabbi Rosen in New York when I was interviewing to hopefully come to Beth Yeshurun 18 years ago. And we were joking about some of the challenges of being a congregational rabbi. And Rabbi Rosen told me a story about a young colleague who went to an older rabbi asking his advice. How do you respond when someone in the congregation you may not have seen in years comes up to you and says, "Rabbi, do you know my name?" How do you respond? And the older rabbi told the young colleague that if someone comes up to you and says, "Do you know my name?" you simply say to them, "If you don't know your name, how am I supposed to know your name?" I've never tried that, and Rabbi Rosen wasn't telling me to ever try that. But it is a challenge for all of us, whether they're colleagues at work, people in the neighborhood, people that we meet throughout our lives. Why is it important to remember names? We can look at something in this week's Torah portion at the very beginning of the Torah portion. And check out your Chumash for just a moment and turn to page 769. Let's look at the very first two verses. Here it says, "Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'Ohel Moed." On the first day of the second month, in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, saying, and now verse 2 on the top of page 770, says, God says, "Take a census of the whole Israelite community by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names, every male head by head." Remembering that the children of Israel had recently escaped from slavery, my colleague Rabbi Eric Yaffe asked the following questions. How might this census here commanded by God have a way of rehabilitating the slaves and restoring them to a sense of self-worth and pride? Why was it so important taking this group of former slaves and commanding the taking of a census by name? This is perhaps the first human census. There's little suggests that this was a common practice at the time. What was the purpose of the census? Why does God have them take their time? Why does the Torah spend almost an entire Torah portion telling us about the numbers and about the names about this first census? If the purpose of the census had been purely administrative, wouldn't estimates have been enough? And why did God need a census? Did the God of the burning bush, the God who sent the plagues to Egypt, the God who parted the sea of reeds, need someone to count the Israelites? Could not this God, our God, who performed all these miracles, have produced an exact number, or at least an estimate? And why was it necessary for the census to have been organized according to families or clans, rather than by individual by individual? Let's look back at verse 2 for just a moment and look at the Hebrew at the very top of page 770. The Hebrew is Se'u et Rosh. Se'u et Rosh. It's translated here as take a census, but Se'u et Rosh literally means lift up the head of the whole Israelite community. What God is really saying is take a census, but literally saying, God is saying, lift up the heads of the whole Israelite community. It's translated as a census, but it's literally not a census. The word, according to the commentators, the Ramban tells us that Se'u is only used, lifting up the head is only used when the intention is to indicate greatness, that is, holding high one's head. Rashi tells us that this verse reminds us that because of Israel's love for God, God numbered them. Take a census of the whole Israelite community by mispar shmot. Look at the end of the verse. Take a census of all the Israelite community by its clans of ancestral houses, listing the names. But mispar shmot. List the names. The Malbim, a commentator, tells us when the Torah here tells us to list the names, what actually happened is everyone said his name to Moses and Aaron, and they all lined up, said their names to Moses and Aaron, and they wrote their names in a book. And afterwards they counted the names and knew how many people were there. According to the number of his names, the Sephardim, the great Italian commentator, says, for at that time every one of that generation was designated by his name, which indicated and reflected stature and character. As Rashi indicates, the census, as we can see here, if we look at the words closely enough, was clearly not done for God's sake. God could come up with an estimate of how many Israelites there were, but this census was taken for the sake of the children of Israel. In what way is the carrying out of census a sign of God's love for our people? The manner of conducting the census, look at the mall beam. Think of how cumbersome it was to write down everyone's name in that book. Why have everyone write his name in a book rather than just simply have them all line up and count? According to the Rambam, in what way does the census contribute to the greatness, that is the self-esteem of the people of Israel? Now, let me provide some answers. The first census, if we look at the words closely enough, the first census in human history was ordered by God as a sign of God's love and concern for our people and as an instrument for enhancing their confidence and feelings of self-worth. Not a single person was to be forgotten. A mass of oppressed slaves who in Egypt had no individual worth whatsoever were now merit individual counting. As slaves, their lives weren't important. Now God cared so much for the people that not only were they counted, but their names were recorded. And why was the mechanism of counting to record the names in a book used? Because according to Sforno, everyone from that generation would then be thought of by his name, and thus by his own unique personal qualities. And why was the count organized by families? Because slaves are denied the security of family life, while for civilized people, the family is at the core of what keeps a civilization alive. It's the instrument for building identity, ethical commitment, and devotion tradition. Does this obsession to know the former slaves by their individual names seem excessive? Not at all. What is more important than being known by our right name? Is anything more connected to the depth of our being than our name? If you wish to connect to another person, what is the first thing you do? You learn his or her name. And what do people expect in their synagogues, by their synagogue leaders? That we know their names. Let us remember the most trusted servant of God was Moses. And what did God say to Moses? I've singled you out by name. Can we aspire in our synagogues that our members cease to be not unidentified mass of people, but rather just as God knew Moses, just as God commanded the Israelites here, Moses and Aaron, the leaders, to record everyone's name, can we continue to learn other people's names? We're reminded of the importance of names, especially for us as Jews. We're very blessed as American Jews that in many ways we have several names. We have our English names and we have our Hebrew names. And when we name our children or when we advise our children or give them advice when they name our grandchildren, can we remind them of the importance of that name as well? In many ways that symbolizes our essence, who we are. The rabbis teach us in many ways we're all given at least three names. The names given by our parents, the names of our families from whom we come from, and the name of those people who were named for. Who comes after us? But after those three names, the rabbis teach us that the most important name of all is the name we make for ourselves. The Shem Tov, the good name, that we hope that we create a reputation for ourselves that brings pride to our families and to our legacies. But knowing people's names, understanding where they come from, seeing who they are, understanding the mark they make, reminds us of humility. It reminds us that if Moses and Aaron took the time to know everyone's names, shouldn't we do the same? Let me conclude with the story one of my colleagues once shared with me. He writes the following: during my second month of college, our professor gave us a pop quiz. I was a very diligent student and had breezed through the questions until I read the very last question on this pop quiz. It said, "What is the first name of the woman who cleans the school?" Surely this was some kind of joke, I thought. I had seen the cleaning woman several times. She was tall, dark-haired, in her 50s, but how would I know her name? I handed in my paper, leaving the last question blank. Just before class ended, one student asked if the last question would count towards our quiz grade. "Absolutely," said the professor. "In your careers, you will meet many people. All are significant. They deserve your attention and care, even if all you do is smile and say hello. I've never forgotten that lesson, and I also learned that the cleaning woman's name was Dorothy. Shabbat shalom, everybody.